He doesn't belong in first class. Get him off this plane before I call security myself!
The words sliced through the first-class cabin of Delta Flight 447 like a blade sharp enough to make every passenger within earshot freeze mid-conversation. The voice belonged to Victoria Blackwood, a stunning brunette whose designer silk blouse and perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the venom in her tone. She stood in the aisle, pointing a manicured finger at a quiet black man sitting calmly in seat 2A reading what appeared to be a technical manual. The man didn't even look up. But in exactly 14 minutes, Victoria Blackwood would discover that the man she was trying to humiliate had the authority to ground every commercial aircraft in American airspace, and her racist outburst would be the least of her problems. Before we dive into the story that changed aviation forever and made headlines from Miami to Moscow, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, because what happened on this flight didn't just expose one woman's prejudice. It unraveled an international criminal operation and became the most viral aviation incident in history. And if this story moves you even a little, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you're going to want to share this one. Now, let's rewind to 6:30 p.m. at Miami International Airport, where the evening departure rush was in full swing and Gate B-47 was buzzing with the controlled chaos of international travel. The massive Boeing 777-300ER sat gleaming on the tarmac, its Delta livery reflecting the setting sun. Flight 447 to Paris. Charles de Gaulle was running 30 minutes behind schedule due to thunderstorms, which meant 396 increasingly irritated passengers were about to be trapped together for 8 hours and 45 minutes. In the first-class cabin, 8 luxury pods awaited their occupants. Cream leather seats that converted to fully flat beds, 23-inch entertainment screens, and enough legroom to host a small meeting. These seats cost more than most people's monthly salary, and Victoria Blackwood felt that price tag entitled her to more than just extra champagne. It entitled her to choose her neighbors. The evening air crackled with tension that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Miami International was on heightened security alert following recent incidents involving passenger misconduct and aviation safety violations. Federal authorities had quietly increased their presence, though most travelers remained unaware of the additional scrutiny. Among the bustling crowd of international travelers, business executives rushed past families dragging oversized suitcases while flight crews moved with practiced efficiency through the maze of departure gates. The intercom crackled with announcements in English, Spanish, and French, creating a polyglot symphony of modern travel. But in first-class cabin of Flight 447, all of that background noise was about to fade away, because Victoria Blackwood had just spotted something that in her narrow worldview didn't belong. And the quiet man in seat 2A was about to teach her a lesson about assumptions that would echo through aviation history. The stage was set. The players were in position, and in less than 15 minutes, everything Victoria Blackwood thought she knew about power, privilege, and authority was going to come crashing down around her designer heels. Dominic Rivers settled into seat 2A with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent half his life on aircraft. At 45, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. Tonight, he wore a simple navy pullover, dark jeans, and comfortable walking shoes, the uniform of a man traveling incognito. His worn leather messenger bag sat tucked beneath the seat in front of him, containing documents that most passengers would never see. The manual in his hands wasn't light reading. Federal Aviation Administration Airport Security Protocols. Revised Edition 2024 wasn't exactly a page-turner, but for Dominic it was necessary preparation. As the FAA's Deputy Administrator for Safety Operations, he was traveling to Paris not for vacation, but for a classified investigation into anonymous reports of safety violations at Charles de Gaulle Airport. What the other passengers didn't know, what even the airline didn't know, was that Dominic Rivers held one of the most powerful positions in American aviation. With a single phone call, he could ground any aircraft, shut down any airport, or initiate federal investigations that could destroy careers and companies. But tonight he looked like any other tired traveler heading to Europe. His calm demeanor masked years of experience dealing with discrimination. Growing up in Detroit, earning his aerospace engineering degree from MIT, climbing the ranks of Federal Aviation Administration, Dominic had faced prejudice at every level. He'd learned that the best response wasn't anger. It was excellence. And patience, because eventually truth had a way of surfacing. Tonight held special significance. His daughter, Isabella, would begin pilot training at the prestigious French Aviation Academy next week. At 22, she was following in her father's footsteps, determined to break barriers in an industry still dominated by men who looked nothing like her. Dominic's presence in Paris would be a surprise. He'd told Isabella he couldn't make it due to work commitments. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was responsible for the safety of American aviation, being judged unworthy of a first-class seat by a woman who'd never spent a day ensuring aircraft could fly safely. Victoria Blackwood glided through the aircraft door like she owned the plane. At 38, she was stunning in the way that required significant financial investment. Personal trainers, stylists, cosmetic procedures, and a wardrobe that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Her silk cream blouse was unbuttoned just enough to suggest without being obvious, paired with a fitted black pencil skirt that hugged curves maintained through twice-daily Pilates sessions. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the aircraft floor with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. The $50,000 worth of jewelry adorning her wrists, neck, and ears wasn't just decoration, it was armor. Each piece announced her status, her wealth, her belief that she occupied a different tier of humanity than the economy passengers shuffling past the first-class cabin curtain. Victoria had built her identity around being desired and envied. Her Instagram account boasted 200,000 followers who lived vicariously through her luxury lifestyle, private jets, five-star hotels, exclusive galas, where champagne cost more per bottle than minimum wage workers earned in a week. She cultivated an image of effortless perfection, never revealing that her marriage was a business arrangement and her charity work was mostly tax evasion. Tonight's trip to Paris was supposedly for a charity gala supporting children's education in developing countries. In reality, Victoria knew nothing about children or developing countries. She was traveling to Paris because her husband Nathan had insisted on this particular flight, this particular date, for reasons he'd been vague about. What Victoria didn't know was that her husband's pharmaceutical company was using commercial flights to transport illegal drug shipments to European distributors. And what Nathan didn't know was that his wife's racist outburst was about to destroy carefully laid plans that had taken months to orchestrate. Nathan Blackwood appeared to be just another wealthy businessman, but his calm exterior concealed growing panic. At 42, he'd built Meridian Pharmaceuticals into a billion-dollar empire through legitimate means and increasingly illegal shortcuts. The legitimate business provided perfect cover for trafficking synthetic drugs that couldn't be detected by standard airport security. Tonight's flight carried more than passengers. Hidden in specially designed pharmaceutical containers in the cargo hold were experimental stimulants worth $50 million on the European black market. Nathan's encrypted phone contained communications with buyers, distributors, and corrupt officials who'd made this operation possible. The timeline was critical. His European partners expected delivery within 48 hours. Delays would cost millions and potentially expose the entire network. Nathan needed this flight to proceed smoothly, quietly, without any attention from authorities. His wife's behavior was threatening everything. Nathan had married Victoria for her beauty and social connections, not her intelligence or discretion. Her racism embarrassed him, but usually in controlled social settings where damage could be contained. On an aircraft at 37,000 feet, with federal regulations and security protocols, her prejudice could destroy him. The encrypted phone in his jacket pocket buzzed constantly with messages from nervous partners. The operation had taken 8 months to arrange. Legitimate pharmaceutical shipments provided cover-corrupt cargo handlers ensured packages reached the right destinations, and bought officials guaranteed minimal inspection. One phone call from the wrong person could unravel everything. Maria Santos had been Delta's lead flight attendant for 8 years, and she'd seen every type of passenger behavior imaginable. At 29, she possessed the diplomatic skills of a UN ambassador and the patience of a kindergarten teacher. Her professional training emphasized de-escalation, customer service, and maintaining cabin security. But nothing in her training manual covered passengers demanding the removal of others based purely on race. Maria recognized trouble the moment Victoria Blackwood's voice rose above the cabin's ambient noise. As a Hispanic woman who'd faced her own share of discrimination, she understood the dangerous territory this situation was entering. Her body camera standard equipment for all flight attendants following recent federal mandates was already recording. The other passengers remained unaware that they were about to witness aviation history. Miami International Airport pulsed with the rhythm of global travel as evening descended over South Florida. Gate B-47 hummed with the controlled chaos of international departure where 396 passengers waited to board Delta Flight 447 to Paris, Charles de Gaulle. The massive Boeing 777-300ER sat gleaming on the rain-slicked tarmac, its fuselage reflecting the amber glow of airport lighting as thunderclouds gathered on the horizon. The terminal's soaring glass walls revealed a sky that shifted between deep purple and electric blue, with lightning flickering in the distance like nature's own strobe lights. The storm system moving across South Florida had already delayed dozens of flights, creating a bottleneck of frustrated travelers and adding 30 minutes to Flight 447's departure time. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin represented the pinnacle of commercial aviation luxury. 8 individual pods were arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each featuring cream-colored leather that looked more suited to a high-end law office than an airplane. The seats converted to fully flat beds with Egyptian cotton linens, while 23-inch high-definition screens offered entertainment libraries that most home theaters would envy. The cabin itself measured 42 feet in length, separated from premium economy by a solid partition that created an exclusive sanctuary for passengers willing to pay 5 times the economy fare. Ambient lighting bathed everything in a warm, golden glow, while the gentle hum of the aircraft's environmental systems created a cocoon of privilege at 35,000 feet. Each pod offered privacy panels that could be raised for complete seclusion, personal storage compartments, large enough for small suitcases and dining tables that could accommodate full multi-course meals served on bone china. The carpet beneath the seats was thick enough to muffle footsteps, and the overhead bins were crafted from polished wood that wouldn't look out of place in a luxury yacht. Tonight's passenger manifest read like a guest list for an exclusive resort. Business executives heading to European meetings, wealthy retirees beginning month-long vacations, and trust fund children treating international travel like others might treat a subway ride. The demographic was overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly wealthy, and overwhelmingly accustomed to spaces where their presence was never questioned. The main cabin stretched back 180 feet behind the first-class partition, housing 364 passengers in premium economy and standard seating. Families with excited children heading to Disney World Paris, college students backpacking through Europe, business travelers trying to sleep before morning meetings in London. The diversity of economy class stood in stark contrast to the homogeneous luxury of first class. Captain James Mitchell had been flying international routes for 20 years, accumulating over 15,000 hours in command of wide-body aircraft. Tonight's flight plan called for a northeastern route over the Atlantic, avoiding the worst of the storm system but still promising some turbulence during the first hour of flight. The crew had reviewed weather reports, alternate airports, and fuel calculations with the thoroughness that comes from years of experience. The flight deck of the Boeing 777 resembled a sophisticated computer laboratory more than traditional cockpit imagery might suggest. 6 large display screens showed everything from navigation data to engine performance, while hundreds of switches, buttons, and indicators provided control over every aircraft function. Tonight, those screens would display more than routine flight information. In the cargo hold, temperature-controlled compartments maintained precise conditions for various shipments. Legitimate pharmaceutical products occupied most of the space insulin shipments for European hospitals, research medications for clinical trials, vaccines for international health organizations. Hidden among these legitimate shipments were containers that looked identical, but contained cargo worth more than most people's houses. Airport security had been heightened following recent incidents involving passenger misconduct and aviation safety violations. Federal air marshals moved through terminals in casual clothes while additional screening procedures had been implemented for international flights. Most travelers remained unaware of the additional security presence, but trained observers could spot the signs extra personnel in strategic positions, subtle radio communications, and the careful attention paid to passenger behavior during boarding. The gate area buzzed with conversations in multiple languages as passengers checked phones, reviewed boarding passes, and prepared for the 8-hour journey ahead. Children complained about delayed departures while parents tried to maintain patience. Business travelers typed urgently on laptops trying to complete final emails before electronic devices had to be stowed. None of them knew they were about to witness an incident that would change aviation security protocols forever. The boarding process began with the usual hierarchy of commercial aviation. First-class passengers entered first, followed by premium economy, then the gradual zones that sorted hundreds of passengers by status loyalty programs and ticket prices. Dominic Rivers presented his boarding pass to the gate agent with a polite nod, noting the subtle recognition in her eyes as she scanned the code that identified him as federal personnel. He walked through the jet bridge with unhurried steps, greeting the flight crew with quiet professionalism. Maria Santos smiled warmly as she directed him toward seat 2A, though she had no idea she was speaking to one of the most powerful officials in American aviation. To her, he appeared to be just another passenger, perhaps a professor or business consultant based on his casual attire and intellectual demeanor. Dominic settled into his pod, arranged his reading materials, and pulled out his phone to send a quick message to his daughter Isabella. "Safe travels, Dad. Can't wait to hear about Paris when you return," came her immediate reply along with a photo of herself in a pilot's uniform from training orientation. She looked radiant, confident, ready to conquer the sky just as he had decades earlier. The irony struck him as he tucked the phone away. Here was a man who ensured the safety of millions of air travelers, annually being treated with casual indifference by fellow passengers who would panic if they knew half the safety challenges his office handled daily. But anonymity was exactly what he wanted tonight. The investigation in Paris required discretion, not recognition. Victoria Blackwood made her entrance 15 minutes later, her heels announcing her arrival before she appeared in the cabin doorway. She paused there for a moment, surveying the space like a queen inspecting her domain, ensuring other passengers had time to notice her ensemble, her jewelry, her carefully cultivated image of effortless sophistication. Her husband, Nathan, followed closely behind, but his attention remained fixed on his phone rather than the luxury surrounding them. His fingers moved rapidly across the screen, responding to encrypted messages that grew more urgent with each passing minute. The pharmaceutical shipment timeline was tight, and European partners were growing nervous about delays. Victoria's satisfaction at being in first class evaporated the moment she spotted Dominic in seat 2A. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together in confusion, then irritation as she processed what she was seeing. A black man in casual clothes reading what appeared to be technical documentation occupying space she felt should be reserved for people who looked more like her. "Excuse me," she said to Maria Santos, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they expect immediate attention. "I think there might be some mistake with seating assignments." Maria approached with professional courtesy, though something in Victoria's tone had already triggered her internal warning systems. Years of flight attendant experience had taught her to recognize passengers who would cause problems before they escalated into incidents that required federal reports. "How can I help you, Mrs. Blackwood?" Maria asked, consulting her tablet that displayed passenger information, seating charts, and special service requests. Victoria gestured towards Dominic with a subtle hand motion that she probably thought was discreet, but was obvious to anyone paying attention. "That gentleman in 2A, I'm concerned there might be some confusion about his ticket. This is first class, and he's dressed so casually. Are you certain his reservation is correct?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished match. Other passengers began to notice the conversation, some pretending to focus on their phones while straining to hear every word. The cabin's ambient noise seemed to decrease as people unconsciously held their breath. Dominic heard every word, of course. His years in federal service had sharpened his ability to monitor conversations while appearing completely absorbed in other activities. He turned a page in his manual with deliberate calm, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the first time he'd faced such assumptions, and it wouldn't be the last. Maria glanced at her tablet, then at Dominic, then back at Victoria. "Mr. Rivers is a confirmed first-class passenger, Mrs. Blackwood. His reservation is completely valid. Is there anything else I can help you with?" The use of Dominic's surname caused Nathan to look up from his phone for the first time since boarding. Something about that name triggered a vague recognition, though he couldn't place it immediately. His pharmaceutical business required extensive interaction with federal agencies, including the Department of Transportation and its aviation subsidiary. The name Rivers appeared somewhere in his memory, associated with authority and oversight. But Victoria's indignation drowned out Nathan's cautious instincts. "Did you check his identification? Because frankly, I find it hard to believe that someone dressed like that could afford a first-class ticket to Paris. Maybe he found a lost boarding pass or used stolen credit cards. These things happen more often than airlines want to admit." The racism in her words was barely concealed beneath a veneer of concern for security. She spoke loudly enough for other first-class passengers to hear clearly, expecting support for her position. Instead, she found uncomfortable silence and averted gazes. Dr. Michael Thompson, a retired military officer in Seat 4. He recognized the situation developing and felt his stomach tighten with disgust. He'd served with men and women of every race and background, measuring people by their character and competence rather than their appearance. Victoria's behavior represented everything he'd fought against during his service. Sarah Williams, the social media influencer in Seat 3B, quietly activated her phone's camera function. Her 150,000 Instagram followers had made her sensitive to moments that could go viral, and this situation had all the hallmarks of content that would explode across social platforms. She began recording discreet video while appearing to check messages. Meanwhile, in economy class, the Rodriguez family was settling into their seats for what they expected would be a routine flight to visit relatives in Spain. Miguel Rodriguez, an auto mechanic from Miami, had saved for 2 years to afford these tickets for his wife Carmen and their twin daughters. None of them knew they were about to witness aviation history. Nathan Blackwood's phone buzzed again with another urgent message from European partners. The shipment timeline was becoming critical, and any delays could trigger suspicion from customs officials who weren't part of their operation. He needed this flight to depart smoothly, quietly, without any attention from authorities. His wife was creating exactly the kind of attention that could destroy everything. Victoria Blackwood was not accustomed to being ignored, and Maria Santos's professional dismissal of her concerns only intensified her determination. She adjusted her silk blouse with the kind of calculated movement designed to draw attention, then positioned herself in the aisle where her voice would carry throughout the first-class cabin. "I understand you have policies," Victoria said, her tone shifting from merely entitled to genuinely threatening, "but as a first-class passenger who pays premium prices for premium service, I have reasonable expectations about the caliber of people sharing this space. Security standards have obviously declined if just anyone can purchase these seats." Maria felt her chest tighten with the recognition that this situation was about to escalate beyond normal passenger service issues. Her 8 years of experience had taught her to identify passengers who would push boundaries, but Victoria's behavior was crossing lines that triggered federal aviation regulations about discrimination and harassment. Mrs. Blackwood Maria replied carefully, "I assure you that all passengers in first class have valid reservations and appropriate documentation. Mr. Rivers's ticket was purchased through proper channels, and his identification has been verified through our usual security protocols." Dominic continued reading his FAA manual, though every word of Victoria's complaint was being catalogued in his memory. As Deputy Administrator for Safety Operations, he'd reviewed hundreds of passenger incident reports, discrimination complaints, and aviation security violations. He knew exactly which federal regulations Victoria was violating with each escalating comment. But he also knew the value of patience. Let her continue talking. Let her build an undeniable record of behavior that would support whatever consequences followed. His years of investigating aviation incidents had taught him that the most damaging evidence often came from perpetrators who couldn't stop talking. Nathan Blackwood glanced up from his encrypted phone conversation with growing unease. His wife's voice was attracting exactly the kind of attention that could jeopardize the carefully planned pharmaceutical operation. Every additional minute of delay increased the risk that cargo inspections might discover shipments that weren't supposed to exist. Victoria, Nathan said quietly, trying to signal her to lower her voice. "Perhaps we should just settle in for takeoff. I'm sure everything is fine." Victoria turned toward her husband with the kind of withering look she usually reserved for service staff who moved too slowly. "Everything is not fine, Nathan. I paid $12,000 for this seat because I expect a certain standard of passenger. Look at him. He's wearing clothes from Walmart and reading what appears to be some kind of technical manual. Does that sound like first-class material to you?" Dr. Michael Thompson shifted uncomfortably in seat 4A. As a retired Air Force colonel, he'd spent 30 years serving with exemplary officers of every background imaginable. Victoria's comments triggered memories of integration battles he'd fought decades earlier when prejudice wore military uniforms and hid behind regulation handbooks. "Ma'am?" Dr. Thompson interjected with military authority. "I've been traveling first class for 20 years, and I've never seen passenger attire mentioned as a qualification for seating assignments. Perhaps you might consider focusing on your own journey rather than scrutinizing fellow travelers." Victoria's face flushed with indignation at being challenged by another passenger. "I beg your pardon, but this is a conversation between myself and the flight attendant. I don't recall asking for input from other passengers." Sarah Williams, the social media influencer, had been discreetly recording video from the moment Victoria began her complaint. Her phone captured every word, every gesture, every escalating moment of what was clearly becoming a racist incident at 37,000 feet. Her 150,000 Instagram followers would want to see this, but more importantly, this kind of behavior needed to be documented and exposed. "Actually," Sarah said with the confidence that comes from having an audience, "I think all passengers have an interest in how discrimination is handled on this aircraft. I'm recording this interaction for my social media followers, and I think they'd be very interested to hear your concerns about passenger qualifications." The mention of social media and recording triggered panic in Nathan Blackwood. Media attention was the absolute last thing their operation needed. His pharmaceutical business depended on maintaining a low profile while moving shipments through international channels. Viral videos and public scrutiny could destroy months of careful planning. "Victoria, please," Nathan said more urgently, "let's just enjoy the flight. We have important business in Paris and we can't afford any delays or complications." But Victoria had passed the point of rational consideration. The combination of being challenged by other passengers and having her authority questioned by airline staff had triggered her most entitled instincts. In her worldview, wealth and beauty granted her the right to control her environment, including the race and appearance of people sharing her space. "I want to speak with the captain," Victoria announced loudly enough for passengers in premium economy to hear. "If this airline is going to allow security risks to purchase first-class tickets, then I demand to know what other safety protocols have been compromised. For all we know, this person could be traveling with false identification or stolen credit cards." Maria Santos realized the situation had moved beyond her authority as lead flight attendant. Victoria's escalating accusations were creating a potential federal incident that required captain involvement. She pressed the discreet call button that would summon Captain Mitchell from the flight deck. Dominic Rivers continued reading his manual, but his other hand moved casually to his jacket pocket, where his phone contained direct communication with FAA headquarters. One text message could trigger federal protocols that would ground this aircraft and initiate investigations that would change everyone's evening plans. The first-class cabin had become a pressure cooker of tension, racism, and underlying criminal activity that none of the passengers fully understood. Victoria's prejudice was about to collide with federal authority, international drug trafficking, and social media exposure in ways that would make this flight unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Captain Mitchell's voice came through the cabin intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay while we address a passenger service issue. We appreciate your patience and expect to begin pushback shortly." But Captain Mitchell had no idea he was about to become part of an incident that would change federal aviation policy forever. While Victoria Blackwood continued her increasingly racist tirade in first class, her behavior was being documented by multiple passengers across the aircraft who sensed they were witnessing something significant. The digital age had turned every passenger into a potential journalist, and Victoria's discriminatory comments were about to become evidence in federal investigations she never imagined. Sarah Williams, positioned in seat 3B with a perfect view of the confrontation, had been live streaming for the past 10 minutes to her 150,000 Instagram followers. Her phone captured every word of Victoria's complaints in high-definition clarity, while her commentary provided real-time analysis for viewers tuning in from around the world. "Okay, guys, I'm on Delta Flight 447 to Paris, and we're witnessing some seriously problematic behavior right now," Sarah whispered into her phone while keeping the camera focused on Victoria. "This woman has been complaining about a black passenger in first class for the past 15 minutes, claiming he doesn't belong here based entirely on his clothing and appearance. This is textbook racism happening in real time." The livestream viewer count climbed rapidly as Sarah's followers shared the stream across social platforms. Comments poured in from viewers expressing outraged disbelief and demands for the woman's identification so she could face consequences for her behavior. The hashtag DeltaFlight 447 began trending on Twitter within minutes. In economy class, Miguel Rodriguez had been trying to keep his twin daughters entertained when raised voices from first class caught his attention. As a mechanic who'd faced his own share of discrimination, Miguel recognized the tone of Victoria's complaints immediately. He pulled out his phone and began recording, knowing that evidence of racism needed to be preserved and shared. "Carmen," he whispered to his wife in Spanish, "that woman up front is harassing a black passenger. She's claiming he doesn't belong in first class because of how he's dressed." Carmen Rodriguez, a nurse at Miami General Hospital, had seen enough prejudice in healthcare settings to recognize the dangerous escalation happening in Victoria's voice. "Record everything, Miguel. People need to see this behavior and understand what still happens every day." The Rodriguez family's recording captured audio from their economy seats that would later become crucial evidence in federal hearings. Their perspective provided confirmation that Victoria's behavior was audible throughout the aircraft, creating a hostile environment for multiple passengers beyond just her immediate target. Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, had activated his phone's voice recorder when Victoria first began her complaints. His military experience had taught him to document incidents that might require official reporting, and Victoria's behavior clearly crossed lines that would interest federal authorities. "Documentation is crucial," Dr. Thompson murmured to himself, while his phone captured Victoria's escalating accusations. "This woman is creating a federal incident through her discriminatory harassment, and someone in authority needs to understand the full scope of her behavior." His recording would later provide crucial evidence about the timeline of Victoria's complaints and the explicit racial bias in her language. Federal investigators would particularly note his observation that Victoria's behavior constituted a clear violation of civil rights protections in federal airspace. Meanwhile, in Seat 6A, technology consultant Bradley Kim had been monitoring Wi-Fi signals when he noticed unusual encrypted data transmission from somewhere in first class. His laptop screen showed communication patterns that suggested illegal financial activity, though he couldn't determine the source without more sophisticated analysis tools. Interesting, Bradley mumbled, capturing screenshots of the data patterns. Someone up front is running serious encryption during boarding. That's not normal passenger behavior. His technical documentation would later provide crucial evidence about Nathan Blackwood's pharmaceutical trafficking operation, creating a timeline that correlated with Victoria's racist outburst. Federal investigators would use Bradley's data to trace communications that revealed the full scope of the criminal enterprise. Flight attendant Maria Santos had been discreetly operating her body camera since Victoria's first complaint following federal protocols that required documentation of potential discrimination incidents. Her camera captured high-quality video of Victoria's behavior, Nathan's nervous phone usage, and Dominic's calm response to increasingly hostile treatment. Body camera activated for potential passenger incident, Maria reported quietly into her communication device. Recording discriminatory harassment of passenger in Seat 2A by passenger in Seat 1A. Situation escalating and may require captain intervention. Her professional documentation would become the primary evidence in multiple federal investigations, providing official verification of every aspect of the incident from boarding through its eventual resolution. The body camera footage would later be referenced in congressional hearings about aviation civil rights protections. In Seat 7, retired teacher Dorothy Harrison had been watching Victoria's behavior with growing disgust. As an educator who'd spent 40 years promoting diversity and inclusion, she understood the importance of confronting racism rather than remaining silent when witnessing discrimination. "Excuse me, young lady," Dorothy called toward Victoria with the authority that only retired teachers can muster. "Your behavior is absolutely unacceptable. That gentleman has shown nothing but courtesy while you've spent 15 minutes harassing him based on his race and appearance. You should be ashamed of yourself." Dorothy's intervention was captured on multiple recording devices and would later be cited as evidence that Victoria's behavior was recognized as discriminatory by multiple passengers from diverse backgrounds. Her teacher's instinct to confront injustice provided moral authority that federal investigators would reference in their final reports. The collective documentation created an unprecedented record of discrimination in federal airspace. Multiple angles, different perspectives, various recording devices, and diverse witnesses all captured the same essential truth. Victoria Blackwood was engaged in racist harassment of a fellow passenger based entirely on racial bias and assumptions about economic status. What none of these witnesses knew was that their documentation was capturing more than just racism. Nathan Blackwood's nervous phone usage, his encrypted communications, and his growing panic about media attention were all being recorded as evidence of the criminal operation that Victoria's behavior threatened to expose. Federal investigators would later describe this as one of the most thoroughly documented discrimination incidents in aviation history, with evidence that supported prosecution under multiple federal statutes related to civil rights, aviation security, and criminal enterprise. The digital age had turned a routine flight into a real-time court proceeding, with passengers serving as jury witnesses and journalists simultaneously. Victoria Blackwood had no idea that her racist behavior was being preserved for federal prosecutors' congressional investigations and social media platforms that would ensure her actions were never forgotten. While Victoria Blackwood continued her increasingly public campaign to have him removed from first class, Dominic Rivers had begun conducting his own investigation of passenger behavior that extended far beyond racist harassment. His trained eye, as FAA Deputy Administrator for Safety Operations, had detected multiple irregularities that suggested the discrimination incident was only the surface of deeper problems on Flight 447. Nathan Blackwood's behavior patterns immediately caught Dominic's attention. The pharmaceutical executive's constant phone usage during boarding violated federal regulations about electronic devices, But more concerning was the nature of his communications. Dominic's years investigating aviation security had taught him to recognize suspicious patterns, and Nathan's behavior exhibited classic signs of coordinated criminal activity. From his position in Seat 2, Dominic had clear sight lines to observe Nathan's phone usage without appearing to pay attention. His training in federal law enforcement had sharpened his peripheral vision and ability to monitor multiple activities simultaneously, while appearing completely focused on reading his aviation security manual. Nathan's encrypted messaging pattern suggested real-time coordination with external parties about time-sensitive activities. The urgency of his communications, combined with his obvious nervousness about media attention, and his wife's disruptive behavior indicated that Flight 447 was carrying more than passengers to Paris. Dominic discreetly activated the federal monitoring device in his jacket pocket, a sophisticated tool that could intercept electronic communications within a limited range when national security concerns justified surveillance. What he discovered made his years of aviation security experience suddenly relevant in ways he hadn't anticipated. Nathan's phone was transmitting location data, flight status, updates, and cargo manifest information to recipients whose encrypted identities suggested international pharmaceutical distribution networks. The communications referenced specific container numbers, delivery timelines, and European contact protocols that indicated commercial aircraft were being used for illegal transportation. Interesting, Dominic thought while turning a page in his manual. Mr. Blackwood appears to be coordinating drug trafficking operations using commercial aviation as cover. His wife's racist behavior is threatening to expose an international criminal enterprise. The federal monitoring device captured enough communication fragments to establish probable cause for deeper investigation. References to pharmaceutical containers. European delivery schedules and cargo manifest coordination painted a clear picture of organized crime using legitimate business as cover for illegal operations. Dominic faced an ethical dilemma that his training had prepared him to handle. As a federal official responsible for aviation security, he had authority to investigate suspected criminal activity on commercial aircraft. But, as a black man facing racist harassment from passengers, he also had personal interests in how this situation resolved. His phone contained direct communication with FAA headquarters DEA coordination centers and FBI aviation crime units. One message could trigger federal protocols that would ground Flight 447 and initiate investigations that would destroy Nathan's operation and expose Victoria's discrimination to federal prosecutors. But patience had always been Dominic's greatest strength. Let the evidence accumulate. Let the criminals reveal more of their operation. Let the racists expose themselves more completely. Federal investigations were more effective when perpetrators provided comprehensive evidence of their own guilt. While monitoring Nathan's communications, Dominic also observed Victoria's escalating harassment with professional detachment. Her behavior was violating multiple federal statutes related to civil rights in federal airspace, but it was also creating distraction that could be strategically valuable for his investigation of criminal activity. She has no idea Dominic realized that her racist outburst is actually protecting a criminal investigation by diverting attention from her husband's illegal activities. Her discrimination is so obvious that no one's paying attention to his drug trafficking coordination. The irony was remarkable. Victoria's attempts to have him removed from the aircraft were inadvertently exposing her husband to federal prosecution for crimes that carried decades of prison time. Her racism was about to destroy the criminal enterprise she was unknowingly married to. Dominic's federal training had taught him to think in terms of comprehensive investigations rather than immediate reactions. Nathan's operation was clearly part of a larger network involving pharmaceutical companies, international distributors, and corrupt officials. Shutting down one flight would capture two criminals but miss the broader conspiracy. His monitoring device continued intercepting communications that revealed the scope of Nathan's operation. References to monthly shipments, quarterly profit distributions, and annual planning meetings suggested this was an ongoing enterprise that had been operating for months or years. European partners expect delivery within 48 hours, One message fragment revealed. Delays will trigger custom scrutiny that could compromise the entire network. Maintain schedule regardless of passenger issues. The communication patterns indicated that Nathan's operation moved approximately $50 million worth of illegal pharmaceuticals annually through commercial aviation channels. Legitimate pharmaceutical shipments provided perfect cover, while corrupt cargo handlers and bought officials ensured packages reached their destinations without inspection. But Victoria's racist behavior was threatening to trigger exactly the kind of official attention that criminal operations couldn't survive. Her demands for captain involvement security consultation and passenger removal could easily lead to federal investigation of all passengers and cargo aboard Flight 447. Dominic's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from FAA headquarters. Deputy Administrator Rivers, your flight status indicates boarding delays. Please confirm operational security and advise of any issues requiring federal intervention. He responded carefully, monitoring passenger behavior that may require federal attention. Will advise when intervention becomes necessary. Situation developing but contained. The response came immediately, federal support available upon request. DEA and FBI aviation units standing by for coordination if criminal activity suspected. Dominic smiled slightly while appearing to read about cargo security protocols. His colleagues had no idea he was sitting in the middle of an active drug trafficking operation while being harassed by racist passengers who were inadvertently exposing their own criminal activities. The investigation was developing perfectly. Victoria's discrimination was being documented by multiple passengers, creating undeniable evidence for federal prosecution. Nathan's communications were being intercepted and recorded, providing evidence of international drug trafficking, and both criminals were completely unaware that their victim was the federal official with authority to prosecute them both. Patience. Dominic reminded himself while monitoring Nathan's increasingly urgent communications with European drug distributors. Let them provide all the evidence federal prosecutors will need to ensure conviction and maximum sentencing. His daughter Isabella would be so proud when she learned that her father had maintained dignity while facing racism and simultaneously dismantled an international criminal operation. Sometimes justice came from unexpected directions. Captain James Mitchell emerged from the flight deck after receiving Maria Santos's urgent summons, his 20 years of aviation experience immediately recognizing that this passenger service issue had escalated beyond normal complaints about legroom or meal preferences. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable, and Victoria Blackwood's voice had attracted attention from passengers throughout the aircraft. Mrs. Blackwood, Captain Mitchell said with professional authority, "I understand you have concerns about passenger seating. How can I assist you this evening?" Victoria turned toward the captain with renewed confidence, certain that a man in uniform would understand her perspective better than the Hispanic flight attendant who'd dismissed her legitimate security concerns. Captain Mitchell represented authority, and authority would surely recognize that first-class passengers deserved better screening of their cabin mates. "Captain, thank you for coming," Victoria said with artificial sweetness while gesturing towards Dominic. "I've been trying to explain to your staff that there appears to be some mistake with this gentleman's seating assignment. He's obviously not first-class material, and frankly, I'm concerned about security protocols that allow just anyone to purchase premium seats." Captain Mitchell glanced at Dominic, who continued reading his manual with the kind of calm that suggested either complete indifference to the controversy or supreme confidence in his position. Something about the man's composure struck the captain as unusual. Most passengers subjected to such public harassment would show signs of distress, anger, or defensive behavior. "Ma'am, all passengers aboard this aircraft have been properly screened and ticketed according to federal aviation regulations," Captain Mitchell replied diplomatically. "Security protocols are quite thorough, and I assure you that Mr. Rivers's presence poses no threat to passenger safety." The captain's use of Dominic's surname triggered something in Nathan Blackwood's memory. Rivers was definitely familiar from his pharmaceutical business dealings with federal agencies, but he couldn't quite place the context. His encrypted phone buzzed again with urgent messages from European partners who were growing nervous about shipment delays. Victoria's frustration intensified at Captain Mitchell's dismissal of her concerns. "Captain, you're not listening to me. Look at how this person is dressed. Look at what he's reading. Does that appear to be normal first-class passenger behavior to you?" Dominic finally looked up from his manual, removed his reading glasses with deliberate slowness, and made direct eye contact with Victoria for the first time since boarding. His calm, intelligent gaze held hers for several seconds before he spoke with quiet authority that silenced the surrounding conversations. "Ma'am, I'm curious about your qualifications for determining passenger behavior standards," Dominic said with the kind of measured tone that suggested vast reserves of patience being carefully controlled. "Are you employed by this airline? Do you work in aviation security, or are you simply making assumptions based on my appearance?" The directness of his challenge caught Victoria off guard. She'd expected continued silence or defensive protests, not calm questions that exposed the racial bias underlying her complaints. Her face flushed as she realized other passengers were listening to every word of an exchange that was making her motivations uncomfortably clear. "I don't need special qualifications to recognize when someone doesn't belong in first class." Victoria snapped back, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language. "I pay premium prices for premium service, and that includes expectations about the caliber of passengers sharing this space." Sarah Williams, still live-streaming to her growing audience, zoomed in on Victoria's face as she spoke those words. The social media influencer's 150,000 followers were now sharing clips across multiple platforms, with Delta Flight 447 trending on Twitter as viewers expressed outrage about the blatant discrimination they were witnessing in real time. Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, stood up from his seat with military bearing that commanded immediate attention. His 30 years of military service had given him zero tolerance for the kind of prejudice Victoria was displaying, and his sense of duty required intervention when witnessing injustice. "Ma'am, I've served my country for 3 decades alongside exemplary officers of every race and background," Dr. Thompson said with authority that brooked no argument. "Your comments are disgraceful, discriminatory, and completely inappropriate. This gentleman has shown nothing but courtesy while you've spent 20 minutes harassing him based purely on racial bias." Victoria whirled toward Dr. Thompson with fury at being challenged by yet another passenger. "How dare you accuse me of racism? I'm simply concerned about security standards and passenger screening protocols. If pointing out obvious inconsistencies makes me racist, then this airline has serious problems with customer service." But her denial rang hollow when surrounded by mounting evidence to the contrary. Multiple passengers were recording her behavior, documenting language patterns that revealed clear racial bias, and capturing her body language that suggested deep-seated prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns. Captain Mitchell realized the situation had moved far beyond normal passenger complaints into territory that could require federal incident reporting. Victoria's behavior was creating a hostile environment that violated civil rights protections in federal airspace while also threatening the operational security of his aircraft. "Mrs. Blackwood, I need you to return to your seat so we can begin our departure procedures," Captain Mitchell said firmly. "All passengers aboard this aircraft have proper documentation and clearance to fly. Your concerns have been noted, but we need to maintain cabin order for the safety of all passengers." Nathan Blackwood's panic intensified as his wife's behavior attracted exactly the kind of official attention that could destroy months of careful planning. His pharmaceutical operation depended on maintaining a low profile while moving $50 million worth of illegal drugs through international channels. Media attention and federal scrutiny could unravel everything. "Victoria, please," Nathan whispered urgently, grabbing his wife's arm. "We need to sit down and prepare for departure. We have important business in Paris that can't afford any delays or complications." But Victoria had passed the point of rational consideration. The combination of being challenged by multiple passengers dismissed by airline staff and recorded by social media had triggered her most entitled instincts. In her privileged worldview, she was the victim of poor customer service rather than the perpetrator of federal discrimination. "I demand this passenger be removed immediately," Victoria announced loudly enough for economy passengers to hear clearly. "If this airline refuses to maintain appropriate security standards, then I want documentation of my complaints for legal purposes." This person could be traveling with false identification, stolen credit cards, or worse. Dominic's phone vibrated with an encrypted message from FAA headquarters. "Deputy Administrator Rivers' social media reports indicate passenger incident aboard your flight. Please advise if federal intervention required." He typed a careful response, "Situation developing. Discrimination incident documented by multiple witnesses. Possible criminal activity also detected. Will advise when federal protocols should be activated." The irony was perfect. Victoria's racist harassment was being documented for federal prosecution while simultaneously diverting attention from her husband's drug trafficking operation that was also being documented for federal prosecution. Both criminals were destroying themselves while attacking the federal official who would ultimately ensure their conviction. The tension in first class reached a critical threshold as Victoria Blackwood's racist harassment collided with federal regulations, social media documentation, and her husband's desperate attempts to protect his criminal operation. Captain Mitchell realized he was dealing with a situation that extended far beyond normal passenger service issues into territory requiring federal intervention. "Mrs. Blackwood, your behavior is creating a disruptive environment that threatens the safety and security of this aircraft," Captain Mitchell announced with the kind of authority that ends discussions rather than beginning them. "Federal aviation regulations prohibit harassment of passengers based on race, and you're currently violating multiple civil rights protections." Victoria's face turned a deep shade of red as she processed the captain's words. Being accused of racism by an authority figure in front of multiple recording devices and social media streams was not an outcome she'd anticipated when she began her campaign to have Dominic removed from first class. "How dare you accuse me of racism?" Victoria shrieked, her voice carrying throughout the aircraft and causing passengers in economy class to strain forward in their seats to hear the confrontation. "I'm simply concerned about security standards and passenger screening. If that makes me racist in your opinion, then this airline has serious problems with customer service." Nathan Blackwood's panic reached desperation levels as his wife's behavior attracted exactly the kind of federal attention that would destroy his pharmaceutical trafficking operation. His phone buzzed continuously with urgent messages from European partners who were monitoring news reports about Flight 447 and growing nervous about exposure risks. "Victoria, stop talking right now," Nathan hissed, grabbing his wife's arm with enough force to bruise. "You're making everything worse. We need to sit down, shut up, and get to Paris without any more attention." But Victoria was beyond rational control. 20 minutes of having her authority challenged, her concerns dismissed, and her behavior recorded had triggered a complete breakdown of the composure she'd spent years cultivating. The veneer of sophisticated elegance cracked to reveal raw prejudice and entitlement. "Don't you dare tell me to shut up," Nathan Victoria screamed, pulling away from her husband's grip. "I pay $12,000 for this seat, and I'll speak up when security standards are compromised. If this airline wants to let suspicious passengers fly first class, then I have every right to voice my concerns." Dominic Rivers finally closed his FAA manual and stood up to his full height, his calm presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the first-class cabin. His movement was deliberate, controlled, and carried an authority that silenced conversations throughout the aircraft. "Ma'am," Dominic said with quiet power that carried more weight than all of Victoria's screaming, "you've made your position very clear. You believe I don't belong in first class, based on my appearance, my clothing, and your assumptions about my economic status. You've demanded my removal, questioned my identification, and suggested I might be traveling with fraudulent documents." Victoria stared at him with a mixture of fury and surprise. She'd expected continued silence or defensive protests, not the kind of measured response that suggested confidence rather than intimidation. "You've also created a hostile environment for multiple passengers." Dominic continued, his voice remaining calm while carrying unmistakable authority. You violated federal civil rights protections, threatened airline operations, and demonstrated the kind of discriminatory behavior that federal regulations are designed to prevent. Something in Dominic's tone began penetrating Victoria's rage-fueled certainty. This wasn't the response of someone intimidated by her wealth, beauty, or social connections. This was the response of someone who understood federal regulations because he had authority to enforce them. Nathan Blackwood stared at Dominic with growing recognition. The name Rivers, in connection with Federal Aviation Authority, was triggering memories of regulatory meetings, compliance discussions, and the kind of oversight that pharmaceutical companies learned to fear. His face went pale as he began to understand who his wife had been harassing for the past 30 minutes. Captain Mitchell watched the exchange with professional interest, noting that Mr. Rivers was displaying the kind of calm authority that suggested extensive experience dealing with difficult situations. Something about the man's demeanor reminded the captain of federal officials he'd encountered during regulatory investigations. Maria Santos had been recording everything through her body camera, following protocols for potential discrimination incidents. But something about Mr. Rivers' response suggested this situation was about to escalate into federal territory that would require incident reports, regulatory reviews, and possibly criminal investigations. The passengers throughout the aircraft had grown silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Sarah Williams continued live streaming to her now 200,000 viewers, while the Rodriguez family in economy class recorded everything for documentation purposes. Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, watched Dominic's controlled response with admiration. Military training had taught him to recognize authentic authority when he saw it, and Mr. Rivers was displaying the kind of leadership presence that came from years of command responsibility. Mrs. Blackwood Dominic said with finality, "You've spent 30 minutes trying to have me removed from this aircraft. You've questioned my right to be here, demanded verification of my identity, and suggested I might be a security threat. You've done all of this based entirely on racial prejudice and assumptions about economic status." He paused, letting his words settle over the silent cabin like a judgment being delivered. "I think it's time you learned who you've been talking to." The silence that followed was absolute. Every passenger, every crew member, every person on flight 447 understood that they were about to witness a revelation that would change everything about this evening's flight to Paris. Victoria Blackwood had no idea that her racist harassment was about to collide with federal authority in ways that would destroy her life and expose her husband's criminal operation to prosecution that would result in decades of prison time. The revelation that Victoria had been harassing the deputy administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration sent shockwaves through Flight 447 that extended far beyond the first-class cabin. But Dominic's simultaneous exposure of Nathan's drug trafficking operation created a perfect storm of federal crimes that would require coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Captain Mitchell Dominic said with professional authority, "I'm invoking Federal Aviation Security Protocol Alpha 7. This aircraft carries illegal pharmaceutical shipments that require immediate DEA investigation, and we have documented civil rights violations that require FBI attention. I need you to contact Air Traffic Control and request immediate diversion to the nearest federal facility." Captain Mitchell had never encountered a situation requiring federal emergency protocols, but 20 years of commercial aviation had taught him that deputy administrator-level authority was absolute when it came to flight safety and security decisions. "Deputy Administrator Rivers, I'll contact Washington Center immediately," Captain Mitchell replied while moving toward the flight deck. "Do you require any specific federal agencies to be notified of our emergency diversion, DEA, FBI, and FAA investigation units?" Dominic answered while monitoring Nathan's panicked attempts to delete encrypted communications from his phone. "We have international drug trafficking civil rights violations and aviation security breaches that require coordinated federal response." The magnitude of federal crimes aboard Flight 447 was becoming clear to passengers who'd initially thought they were witnessing a simple racism incident. Sarah Williams continued live streaming to her rapidly growing audience, now exceeding 500,000 viewers, as clips spread across global social media platforms. "Guys, this is absolutely insane," Sarah narrated into her phone while recording the unfolding federal emergency. What started as racist harassment has become federal prosecution of drug trafficking, civil rights violations, and aviation security crimes. This woman attacked the one person on this plane with authority to prosecute her behavior. Nathan Blackwood's complete panic was evident as he attempted to destroy evidence of communications with European drug distributors who were expecting $50 million worth of illegal pharmaceuticals to arrive in Paris within 48 hours. His legitimate pharmaceutical business had provided perfect cover for trafficking synthetic drugs through commercial aviation channels. Mr. Blackwood Dominic said while observing Nathan's frantic phone activity, destruction of evidence constitutes additional federal charges. Your communications have already been intercepted and preserved by federal monitoring systems, so damaging your device won't prevent prosecution. The pharmaceutical executive stopped his futile attempts to delete encrypted messages as the reality of his situation became undeniable. Months of careful planning had been destroyed by his wife's racist outbursts that attracted attention from the one federal official with authority to investigate aviation-related criminal activity. Victoria remained frozen in shock as she processed the destruction of everything she'd believed about power authority and her ability to control situations through wealth and intimidation. Her racist harassment of a federal official was being documented for prosecution under civil rights statutes that carried serious prison time. "I demand to speak with my attorney," Victoria finally managed to say, though her voice lacked the imperious tone that had characterized her behavior throughout the harassment campaign. "That's certainly your right," Dominic replied with professional courtesy, "but I should inform you that your attorney will need to be familiar with federal civil rights law, aviation security regulations, and criminal statutes related to interference with flight operations. Your behavior has violated multiple federal codes that carry significant penalties." The irony was remarkable. Victoria had spent an hour threatening federal prosecution of airline personnel for refusing to violate civil rights protections while creating evidence for her own federal prosecution under the same civil rights statutes. Maria Santos, the flight attendant, continued recording through her body camera while marveling at the complete reversal of authority that had transformed a discrimination incident into federal law enforcement action. Her documentation would become crucial evidence in multiple federal investigations. Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, watched Dominic's professional handling of an unprecedented situation with military appreciation for leadership under extreme pressure. Maintaining composure while facing racist harassment, conducting criminal investigation while being discriminated against, and coordinating federal response while ensuring passenger safety. In economy class, the Rodriguez family continued recording everything for documentation purposes, while explaining to their daughters in Spanish that they were witnessing historic aviation incident that would be studied for years to come. Mira Ninas Miguel told his twins this is what happens when people judge others by appearance instead of character. This man maintained dignity while facing prejudice, and now justice will be served. The passengers throughout Flight 447 had grown silent as they realized they were witnessing federal law enforcement action that would result in criminal prosecution, international investigation, and changes to aviation security protocols. Captain Mitchell returned from the flight deck with confirmation that federal authorities were coordinating ground response at Reagan National Airport. Deputy Administrator Rivers Air Traffic Control has cleared us for emergency landing in Washington. DEA, FBI, and FAA investigation units are standing by for immediate response. "Excellent," Dominic replied while monitoring communications with FAA headquarters through his secure phone. Federal prosecutors will need all passenger recordings and airline documentation as evidence for multiple criminal cases. This incident will require coordination with international law enforcement agencies to dismantle the trafficking network. Nathan's pharmaceutical company had been using legitimate business operations to transport illegal drugs through multiple international airports, with corrupt officials ensuring minimal inspection of shipments. The operation involved millions of dollars annually and criminal networks across 3 continents. But Victoria's racist behavior had exposed everything by triggering federal investigation of passenger conduct that revealed criminal activity her husband thought was perfectly concealed. The connection between racism and criminality is often closer than people realize, Dominic observed, while reviewing intercepted communications that revealed the scope of Nathan's operation. Prejudice creates blindness to real threats, while focusing attention on imaginary dangers based on appearance rather than behavior. Victoria's discrimination had been captured on multiple recording devices, live-streamed to global audiences and documented by federal personnel using equipment that would provide indisputable evidence for prosecution under civil rights statutes. Nathan's drug trafficking had been detected through electronic surveillance communication interception and cargo manifest analysis that would provide federal prosecutors with evidence for conviction under international drug trafficking laws. Both criminals had been caught by the federal official they'd been attacking, harassing, and threatening for nearly an hour without realizing his authority to prosecute their behavior and criminal activity. The passengers aboard Flight 447 understood they were witnessing justice being served in real time, with federal authority revealing itself only when necessary to protect civil rights and aviation security. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Mitchell announced through the cabin intercom, "we are beginning our descent into Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport due to federal security concerns. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened as we prepare for landing and federal investigation of criminal activity aboard this aircraft." The most viral aviation incident in history was about to conclude with federal prosecution that would send both criminals to prison for decades, while changing civil rights protections for all airline passengers. As Flight 447 began its emergency descent toward Ronald Reagan, Washington National Airport federal law enforcement agencies coordinated the largest aviation crime response in recent history. Dominic's communication with FAA headquarters had triggered protocols involving multiple agencies' international cooperation and criminal investigations spanning 3 continents. Deputy Administrator Rivers came the voice through his secure phone from FAA Director Sarah Chang. "We have DEA, FBI, and international law enforcement standing by for immediate response. The scope of criminal activity you've uncovered requires unprecedented coordination between agencies." Dominic surveyed the first-class cabin where both criminals sat in stunned silence, their schemes destroyed by racist behavior that had attracted attention from the one federal official with authority to prosecute aviation-related crimes. Director Chang: "We have documented civil rights violations captured on multiple recording devices and witnessed by dozens of passengers," Dominic reported while reviewing the evidence accumulated during Victoria's harassment campaign. "We also have international drug trafficking using commercial aviation as transport, with communications intercepted and preserved for prosecution." The federal response was swift and comprehensive. DEA agents specializing in pharmaceutical trafficking were coordinating with European law enforcement to simultaneously raid distribution networks across multiple countries. FBI civil rights investigators were reviewing social media documentation of Victoria's discriminatory behavior that had been shared globally. Nathan Blackwood stared out the window as Washington's lights grew larger, knowing that his pharmaceutical empire was being dismantled while he watched. His legitimate business operations would be seized as assets derived from criminal activity, while his personal fortune would be frozen pending federal investigation. "Mr. Blackwood," Dominic said with a professional courtesy, "your European partners are currently being arrested by coordinated law enforcement action. Your financial accounts are being frozen, your business assets are being seized, and your communications networks are being traced to identify all participants in the trafficking operation." The pharmaceutical executive's criminal enterprise had involved corrupt cargo handlers, bought customs officials, and legitimate shipping companies unknowingly used as cover for illegal transportation. Federal prosecutors would have evidence for conviction under RICO statutes that carried life imprisonment for organizing criminal enterprises. Victoria remained silent as she processed the destruction of her social standing, financial security, and personal freedom that would result from her racist harassment of a federal official. Her threats to destroy careers had rebounded to destroy her own life through federal prosecution under civil rights laws. Mrs. Blackwood Dominic continued, "Your discriminatory behavior has been documented under federal aviation regulations that prohibit harassment based on race, ethnicity, or appearance. Civil rights organizations are already using recordings of your behavior as evidence for strengthened protections for airline passengers." Captain Mitchell maintained communication with air traffic control while coordinating with federal authorities about ground response procedures. The emergency landing would involve immediate arrest of both criminal seizure of all cargo containers and documentation of every aspect of the incident for federal prosecution. Flight 447. "You are cleared for landing on runway 01, came the controller's voice. Federal response teams are in position for immediate investigation of reported criminal activity. The passengers throughout the aircraft understood they were witnesses to historic federal law enforcement action that would change aviation security protocols forever. Sarah Williams's live stream had reached over 700,000 viewers, sharing clips across every social media platform, making this the most documented aviation incident in history. Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, marveled at Dominic's coordination of complex federal response while maintaining professional composure throughout an hour of racist harassment and criminal investigation. "Outstanding leadership under pressure," Dr. Thompson observed with military appreciation for command authority. "This man handled discrimination, detected criminal activity, and coordinated federal response while maintaining dignity that should serve as example for all federal officials." Maria Santos continued documenting everything through her body camera, knowing that her recordings would become evidence in federal court cases that would be studied for decades. Her professional handling of an unprecedented situation would result in commendation from federal aviation authorities. The Rodriguez family in economy class watched the federal response with admiration for Dominic's patient approach to confronting racism and criminality simultaneously. Their recordings would become part of civil rights history, showing how authority could be wielded with dignity rather than anger. "Papa," one of the twins asked Miguel in Spanish, "why didn't the man get angry when the woman was so mean to him?" "Because, mija, real strength comes from controlling your response rather than letting others control your emotions," Miguel replied while recording the federal law enforcement coordination. This man knew that patience would bring justice more effectively than anger. As Flight 447 approached the runway, federal vehicles surrounded the arrival area. DEA agents prepared to seize pharmaceutical shipments worth millions of dollars, while FBI investigators reviewed social media evidence of civil rights violations that had been shared globally. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic announced through the cabin intercom with the authority his position deserved. "Thank you for your patience during this federal emergency. Your cooperation and documentation have been crucial for ensuring justice in cases involving both civil rights violations and international criminal activity." The aircraft touched down at Reagan National with federal response teams immediately moving into position. Nathan Blackwood would face decades in prison for drug trafficking charges, while Victoria would face federal prosecution for civil rights violations that carried significant penalties. But the most important outcome was the precedent established for protecting civil rights in federal airspace. Victoria's documented harassment would result in strengthened protections for all airline passengers facing discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or appearance. "Federal prosecutors have enough evidence for conviction on multiple charges," Dominic reported to Director Chang as the aircraft taxied toward the gate. "This incident will serve as landmark case for civil rights enforcement in aviation and international criminal prosecution of trafficking networks." The federal response demonstrated that discrimination and criminality would face swift justice when federal authority was properly applied. Both criminals had been caught by the official they'd been attacking without realizing his power to prosecute their behavior and criminal activity. As Flight 447 came to a complete stop at Reagan National Airport, Dominic Rivers stood before the aircraft's 396 passengers with the quiet authority that had carried him through an hour of racist harassment and criminal investigation. Federal response teams surrounded the aircraft, while passengers prepared to witness the conclusion of the most documented aviation incident in history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic announced through the cabin intercom system with calm professionalism that had defined his response throughout the federal emergency. "I want to thank you for your patience during this unprecedented situation. Your cooperation and documentation have been crucial for ensuring justice in cases involving civil rights violations and international criminal activity." The passengers throughout Flight 447 listened with rapt attention as the federal official who'd been subjected to discriminatory harassment explained the law enforcement action that would result from their evening's travel experience. "Mrs. Victoria Blackwood has been arrested for violation of federal civil rights protections, harassment of passengers based on racial bias and interference with aviation operations." Dominic continued with measured authority. "Her behavior has been documented by multiple witnesses and preserved on recording devices that will serve as evidence in federal court." Victoria sat motionless in Seat 1A, her designer clothing and expensive jewelry providing no protection against federal charges that would destroy her social standing, financial security, and personal freedom for years to come. "Mr. Nathan Blackwood has been arrested for international drug trafficking using commercial aviation as transport," Dominic announced while observing Nathan's complete resignation to his fate. His pharmaceutical operation involved millions of dollars in illegal shipments and criminal networks spanning 3 continents. The pharmaceutical executive stared straight ahead as federal agents prepared to board the aircraft, knowing that his business empire had been destroyed by his wife's racist behavior that attracted attention from the one official with authority to investigate aviation-related crimes. Flight 447 was grounded not because of mechanical failure or weather conditions, Dominic explained with the clarity that federal authority deserved, but because criminal activity and civil rights violations created security threats that required immediate federal intervention. Captain Mitchell watched with a professional admiration as Deputy Administrator Rivers concluded the most complex passenger incident in aviation history with dignity that had characterized his response throughout an hour of harassment and investigation. "This aircraft will now be processed as evidence in federal criminal cases," Dominic announced to passengers who understood they'd witnessed historic law enforcement action. "Your recordings, testimonials, and cooperation have ensured that justice will be served for both discrimination and criminal activity detected during this flight." The federal grounding of Flight 447 established precedents for civil rights enforcement and criminal prosecution that would protect airline passengers for generations. Victoria's racist harassment and Nathan's drug trafficking had both been defeated by federal authority, revealed only when necessary to ensure justice. Sometimes, Dominic concluded with quiet power that resonated throughout the aircraft, the most important destination isn't where you plan to go, but where truth leads you. Federal agents boarded Flight 447 with the precision that comes from coordinating complex criminal investigations across multiple jurisdictions. The arrest of Victoria and Nathan Blackwood would conclude the most documented aviation discrimination incident in history while exposing an international drug trafficking network that federal prosecutors had been seeking for months. DEA agent Sarah Martinez approached Nathan's seat with arrest warrant in hand, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement as she delivered charges that would ensure decades of imprisonment. "Nathan Blackwood, you're under arrest for international drug trafficking conspiracy to distribute controlled substances in violation of federal aviation security protocols." Nathan offered no resistance as handcuffs replaced the expensive watch that had symbolized his pharmaceutical empire's success. The legitimate business he'd built over 15 years would be seized as criminal assets while his personal fortune would be frozen, pending federal investigation into money laundering activities. FBI agent Michael Torres moved toward Victoria with equal professionalism, though her arrest carried different significance for civil rights enforcement throughout the aviation industry. Victoria Blackwood, you're under arrest for violation of federal civil rights protections, harassment of passengers based on racial discrimination and interference with commercial aviation operations. Victoria's stunned silence marked the end of her campaign to have Dominic removed from first class, a campaign that had instead removed her from society through federal prosecution, under statutes she'd never known existed. The other passengers watched federal law enforcement with fascination rather than fear, understanding that they'd witnessed justice being served against criminals who'd thought themselves above accountability. Sarah Williams continued live streaming to her now 800,000 viewers, documenting arrests that would be studied in law enforcement academies for years to come. "This is incredible," everyone, Sarah narrated, while recording federal agents processing evidence. "We've just witnessed the most documented case of aviation discrimination in history, along with exposure of international drug trafficking that federal authorities say involved millions of dollars annually." Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, approached Dominic with military respect for leadership under impossible circumstances. "Deputy Administrator Rivers, your handling of this situation exemplifies the kind of dignified authority our nation needs. Maintaining composure while facing discrimination and conducting criminal investigation simultaneously requires exceptional character." Dominic accepted the colonel's praise with characteristic humility, though his mind remained focused on the broader implications of the incident. Victoria's behavior would result in strengthened civil rights protections for airline passengers, while Nathan's operation would trigger enhanced security protocols for pharmaceutical shipments. "Thank you, Colonel Thompson," Dominic replied while observing federal agents documenting evidence. "This incident demonstrates why we must remain vigilant about both discrimination and criminal activity in aviation. Sometimes the greatest threats come from sources we least expect." Maria Santos, the flight attendant, whose body camera had captured crucial evidence, received immediate commendation from federal investigators for her professional documentation of civil rights violations and criminal activity. Her recordings would become primary evidence in federal court cases that would establish precedents for decades. Miss Santos, Agent Martinez said while reviewing body camera footage, "Your documentation has provided indisputable evidence for prosecution under multiple federal statutes. This case will be referenced in civil rights training programs throughout the aviation industry." Captain Mitchell filed reports with federal authorities documenting every aspect of the incident from initial boarding through emergency landing. His professional handling of an unprecedented federal emergency would result in commendation from the Federal Aviation Administration and recognition as exemplary crisis management. The cargo hold of Flight 447 revealed pharmaceutical containers that appeared legitimate, but contained synthetic drugs worth approximately $50 million on European black markets. DEA agents documented packaging, shipping labels, and destination addresses that would enable prosecution of criminal networks across 3 continents. This operation involved corrupt cargo handlers, but customs officials and legitimate shipping companies unknowingly used as cover, Agent Martinez explained while cataloging evidence. Deputy Administrator Rivers's investigation has exposed criminal enterprise that federal prosecutors have been seeking for over a year. Passengers throughout the aircraft provided testimonials to FBI investigators documenting Victoria's discriminatory behavior and Nathan's suspicious communications during boarding. Their cooperation ensured comprehensive evidence for federal prosecution under civil rights and criminal enterprise statutes. The Rodriguez family's recordings from economy class provided crucial verification that Victoria's harassment was audible throughout the aircraft, creating hostile environment for passengers beyond just her immediate target. Their documentation would support federal charges related to civil rights violations and public accommodation. Miguel Rodriguez, your family's cooperation has been invaluable for documenting the scope of discriminatory behavior, Agent Torres said while collecting witness statements. Your recordings provide evidence that this incident affected all passengers aboard Flight 447. The social media documentation had already spread globally, with Delta Flight 447 trending on every platform, as people shared clips of the most dramatic aviation incident in recent memory. Victoria's racist behavior would be preserved forever as example of how prejudice destroys those who practice it. But beyond the viral social media attention, the incident would result in concrete changes to federal aviation policy. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice would reference this case in new guidelines for protecting passengers from discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or appearance. This case establishes clear precedent that discriminatory harassment in federal airspace will face immediate prosecution under civil rights statutes, Agent Torres explained to assembled passengers. Your documentation and cooperation have ensured that airline travel will be safer for all passengers, regardless of their background or appearance. As federal agents completed evidence collection and passenger interviews, the magnitude of the evening's events became clear to everyone aboard Flight 447. What had begun as routine travel to Paris had become federal law enforcement action that would change aviation security forever. Dominic Rivers remained aboard the aircraft until all passengers had been interviewed and evidence had been documented. His sense of duty, ensuring that federal investigation was conducted with thoroughness that would support successful prosecution of both criminals. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dominic announced as passengers prepared to deplane, "thank you again for your cooperation during this federal emergency. Your courage in documenting discrimination and supporting law enforcement will benefit airline passengers for generations to come." The immediate aftermath had demonstrated that federal authority, when properly applied, could ensure swift justice for both civil rights violations and criminal enterprise. Victoria and Nathan Blackwood would face consequences proportional to their crimes, while precedents established tonight would protect future passengers from similar experiences. The legal consequences for Victoria and Nathan Blackwood unfolded with the inexorable precision that federal prosecution brings to cases involving clear evidence and multiple witnesses. Within 48 hours of their arrests aboard Flight 447, both criminals faced charges that would reshape their lives and serve as warning to others who might consider discrimination or criminal activity in federal airspace. Victoria Blackwood's arraignment took place in the United States District Court for the District of Columbia, where federal prosecutors presented evidence that included hours of recorded harassment, multiple witness testimonials, and social media documentation viewed by millions globally. Her racist campaign against Dominic Rivers had violated multiple federal statutes protecting civil rights in commercial aviation. Mrs. Blackwood Judge Patricia Harrington stated while reviewing the comprehensive evidence, "You engaged in discriminatory harassment of a fellow passenger based entirely on racial prejudice. Your behavior created a hostile environment that violated federal civil rights protections and interfered with commercial aviation operations." The prosecutors presented body camera footage from flight attendant Maria Santos, passenger recordings from throughout the aircraft, and live-stream documentation that had been shared across global social media platforms. The evidence was so comprehensive that Victoria's defense attorney could only argue for mitigation rather than innocence. "Your Honor," Victoria's attorney pleaded, "my client acknowledges that her behavior was inappropriate, but she maintains that security concerns motivated her actions rather than racial bias." Judge Harrington reviewed video evidence that showed Victoria's explicit racist language and discriminatory assumptions about passenger qualifications based on appearance and economic status. "Counselor, the evidence clearly demonstrates racial animus rather than legitimate security concerns. Your client specifically questioned this passenger's right to first-class accommodations based on his race and clothing." Victoria received a sentence of 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service at civil rights organizations, and placement on the federal no-fly list that would prevent her from using commercial aviation for 5 years. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism that destroyed her carefully cultivated image of sophistication and elegance. But the social consequences proved more devastating than legal penalties. Miami's exclusive social circles immediately distanced themselves from Victoria, with country clubs revoking memberships, charity organizations removing her from boards, and former friends refusing association with someone whose racism had been documented globally. Nathan Blackwood faced far more severe consequences as federal prosecutors presented evidence of international drug trafficking that involved millions of dollars annually and criminal networks spanning 3 continents. His pharmaceutical company had provided perfect cover for synthetic drug distribution that federal agencies had been investigating for over a year. Mr. Blackwood Judge William Harrison announced during sentencing, "You corrupted legitimate pharmaceutical business to traffic illegal drugs through commercial aviation channels. Your criminal enterprise endangered aviation security while distributing dangerous substances internationally." The evidence against Nathan included intercepted communications with European distributors' financial records showing money laundering through pharmaceutical accounts and cargo manifests documenting illegal shipments disguised as legitimate medical supplies. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case that resulted in a 25-year federal prison sentence. His pharmaceutical empire was dismantled through asset forfeiture proceedings that reclaimed approximately $200 million in criminal proceeds. Legitimate employees lost their jobs when the company collapsed, though federal prosecutors ensured they received assistance finding new employment in companies not connected to criminal activity. The broader criminal network was destroyed through coordinated international law enforcement action that resulted in arrests across Europe, seizure of distribution facilities, and prosecution of corrupt officials who'd enabled the trafficking operation. Dominic's investigation had provided crucial evidence that European authorities used to dismantle criminal enterprises in multiple countries. This case demonstrates the effectiveness of international cooperation in prosecuting aviation-related crimes, announced DEA Administrator Janet Rodriguez during a press conference. Deputy Administrator Rivers's investigation exposed criminal networks that had operated for years by exploiting legitimate pharmaceutical shipping. The civil rights implications of Victoria's behavior resonated throughout the aviation industry as federal authorities implemented new protections for passengers facing discrimination. The Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division used this case to establish clearer guidelines for prosecuting harassment in federal airspace. Civil rights organizations celebrated the swift justice that had been delivered to someone whose racist behavior had been documented so comprehensively. The NAACP referenced this case in congressional testimony, supporting strengthened protections for minority passengers using commercial aviation. The Victoria Blackwood case demonstrates that discriminatory behavior in federal transportation will face immediate prosecution under civil rights statutes, testified NAACP Legal Defense Fund President Rochelle Garza. This precedent ensures that airline passengers cannot be harassed based on race, ethnicity, or perceived economic status. The social media documentation had created permanent record of how racism manifests in everyday situations, providing educational material for diversity training programs throughout the transportation industry. Victoria's behavior became textbook example of implicit bias becoming explicit discrimination. Flight attendant Maria Santos received commendation from the Federal Aviation Administration for her professional documentation of civil rights violations and criminal activity. Her body camera recordings became training material for airline personnel learning to handle discrimination incidents according to federal protocols. Captain James Mitchell was recognized by aviation industry organizations for his handling of unprecedented federal emergency that required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. His professional response under extreme pressure became case study for crisis management in commercial aviation. Dr. Michael Thompson, the retired Air Force colonel, provided testimony to congressional committees considering strengthened civil rights protections in federal transportation. His military perspective on leadership under pressure highlighted Dominic's exceptional handling of discrimination while conducting criminal investigation. The passenger witnesses received recognition from civil rights organizations for their courage in documenting discrimination rather than remaining silent when witnessing injustice. Their recordings provided crucial evidence that ensured successful prosecution under federal statutes. Sarah Williams, the social media influencer whose live stream had reached over 1 million viewers, used her platform to promote civil rights education and aviation safety awareness. Her documentation had created viral content that educated global audiences about discrimination in transportation. The Rodriguez family's recordings from economy class were referenced by immigration rights organizations as evidence that discrimination affects entire communities rather than just direct targets. Their cooperation with federal investigation demonstrated civic responsibility that strengthened prosecution of civil rights violations. The precedents established by the Victoria Blackwood case would protect airline passengers for generations, ensuring that federal aviation space remained free from discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or appearance. The swift justice delivered through federal prosecution sent clear message that such behavior would face serious consequences. Federal prosecutors described this as a landmark case that would be referenced in civil rights training throughout the transportation industry. The comprehensive evidence and severe consequences would deter future discrimination while providing justice for victims of racist harassment in federal airspace. 6 months after Flight 447 was grounded at Reagan National Airport, Dominic Rivers stood in the auditorium of the French Aviation Academy in Paris, watching his daughter Isabella receive her pilot certification alongside 47 classmates from 23 countries. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was finally making the trip to Paris he'd originally planned, though under circumstances he could never have anticipated. Isabella Rivers, now 22, and officially First Officer Rivers, spotted her father in the audience and beamed with pride that illuminated the entire ceremony. Her graduation represented more than personal achievement. It symbolized progress in an industry where women and minorities continued breaking barriers despite facing the kind of prejudice Dominic had encountered aboard Flight 447. Dad, Isabella called as she approached in her crisp pilot's uniform, the gold wings on her lapel catching the auditorium lights. "I can't believe you made it. I thought your investigation schedule wouldn't allow international travel." Dominic embraced his daughter with emotion that had been building for months since the incident that had changed his perspective on discrimination authority and the importance of maintaining dignity when facing prejudice. The viral videos of his calm response had been viewed globally, but Isabella's pride meant more than any public recognition. "Isabella, I wouldn't miss this for anything," Dominic replied while admiring the pilot's uniform that represented years of study training and determination to succeed in a challenging field. "Your accomplishments inspire me every day, especially after what happened on Flight 447. Isabella had followed the federal prosecution of Victoria and Nathan Blackwood through media coverage that had made her father's handling of racism and criminal investigation famous throughout the aviation industry. His calm response had become example of how authority should be wielded with dignity rather than anger. "Dad, watching those videos made me understand why you never told me about the discrimination you faced climbing through federal ranks," Isabella said with mature understanding beyond her years. "You protected me from negativity while teaching me through example how to respond to prejudice with strength rather than bitterness." The graduation ceremony had attracted aviation industry leaders from around the world, many of whom approached Dominic with recognition of his professional handling of an unprecedented federal emergency. His reputation within aviation circles had been enhanced by documentation of his investigation skills and leadership under pressure. Deputy Administrator Rivers said Captain Michelle Laurent, Air France's first female chief pilot, "Your response aboard Flight 447 has become required viewing for our diversity training programs. You demonstrated how federal authority should be exercised with dignity rather than retaliation. But the most meaningful recognition came from fellow parents whose children were breaking barriers in aviation despite facing the kind of discrimination that Dominic had encountered." His example of patience and professionalism had inspired others to respond to prejudice with excellence rather than anger. Later that evening, as father and daughter shared dinner at a Parisian cafe overlooking the Seine, Dominic reflected on lessons learned from an incident that had begun with racist harassment and concluded with federal prosecution of multiple crimes. Isabella, I want you to remember what happened aboard Flight 447, Dominic said while watching lights reflect on the river. Not because of the discrimination we faced, but because of the dignity we maintained. When you encounter prejudice in your aviation career, and unfortunately you probably will remember that your response defines your character. Isabella listened with the attention that important conversations deserve, understanding that her father's experience had broader implications for anyone facing discrimination in professional settings. I learned that the most powerful response to hate isn't anger or retaliation. Dominic continued with conviction earned through experience. It's excellence. It's maintaining your standards when others try to diminish you. It's remembering that their prejudice reflects their limitations, not yours. The conversation was interrupted by Dominic's phone, which displayed a message from FAA Director Sarah Chang. Deputy Administrator Rivers President Martinez wants to nominate you for FAA Administrator. Your handling of Flight 447 demonstrated leadership qualities we need at the highest levels of federal aviation authority. Dominic showed Isabella the message, watching pride illuminate her face as she processed the significance of her father's promotion to the highest position in American aviation. His response to racism had demonstrated qualifications for leadership that federal authorities wanted to recognize officially. "Dad, this is incredible," Isabella exclaimed with joy that reflected her understanding of what this promotion meant for federal aviation leadership. "You'll be the first African-American FAA administrator, and everyone will know you earned it through excellence rather than quotas or politics." The personal resolution was perfect. Dominic's dignity in facing discrimination had been rewarded with the highest position in his field, while his daughter's achievements proved that excellence transcends the prejudice that others might harbor. 1 year after Flight 447, the incident had fundamentally transformed civil rights protections in federal aviation and established precedents that would protect passengers for generations. The comprehensive documentation of Victoria Blackwood's racist harassment had created the most thoroughly evidenced discrimination case in transportation history, while Nathan's criminal prosecution had eliminated an international drug trafficking network. The Department of Transportation implemented the Rivers Protocol, named in honor of Dominic's professional handling of discrimination and criminal investigation under extreme pressure. The new guidelines required immediate federal intervention when passengers faced harassment based on race, ethnicity, or appearance, with airline personnel trained to recognize and document such behavior. Aviation industry organizations incorporated Victoria's documented harassment into mandatory diversity training programs that emphasized the legal consequences of discriminatory behavior in federal airspace. Her racist campaign against Dominic became a textbook example of how prejudice destroys those who practice it rather than their intended targets. Federal prosecutors referenced the Blackwood cases in congressional testimony supporting enhanced penalties for civil rights violations in transportation settings. The swift justice delivered to both criminals sent a clear message that discrimination and criminal activity would face serious consequences when conducted in federal jurisdiction. Civil rights organizations celebrated the precedent that ensured federal transportation remained accessible to all Americans, regardless of race or economic status. The NAACP and other advocacy groups used documentation from Flight 447 to support legislation strengthening protections for minority passengers. Isabella Rivers completed her first year as a commercial pilot with commendations for excellence that reflected her father's emphasis on responding to challenges with competence rather than complaint. Her success demonstrated that barriers in aviation could be overcome through preparation and professionalism. Victoria Blackwood completed her community service requirement at immigration assistance centers, where her work with diverse populations provided education about the humanity she'd failed to recognize aboard Flight 447. Her social media followers had abandoned her completely, leaving her to rebuild identity based on character rather than appearance. Nathan Blackwood remained in federal prison serving his 25-year sentence for drug trafficking. His pharmaceutical empire completely dismantled, and its criminal proceeds forfeited to fund victim assistance programs. His criminal network had been eliminated through international cooperation that protected legitimate pharmaceutical shipping. The social media documentation of Flight 447 remained viral content that educated global audiences about both subtle and explicit forms of discrimination. Sarah Williams continued using her platform to promote civil rights awareness and aviation safety education for her expanding audience. Dr. Michael Thompson's military perspective on leadership under pressure had been incorporated into federal training programs for transportation officials facing crisis situations. His recognition of Dominic's exceptional handling of impossible circumstances provided validation from respected military authority. The lasting legacy extended beyond individual consequences to institutional changes that would protect future generations of airline passengers from experiencing the discrimination that Dominic had faced with such dignity. Most importantly, Flight 447 had demonstrated that federal authority, when properly exercised, could ensure swift justice for both civil rights violations and criminal activity, creating precedents that would strengthen protections for all Americans traveling in federal transportation networks. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from the sky. It comes from the person sitting quietly in seat 2A, reading a book waiting for truth to reveal itself. And when that person happens to hold federal authority over the very system where discrimination occurs, the lesson becomes clear. Respect isn't earned through appearance, wealth, or intimidation. It's commanded through character competence and the courage to maintain dignity when others try to steal it. Victoria Blackwood thought she could judge a man by his clothing and remove him from a space I felt belonged only to people who looked like her. Instead, she discovered that the quiet passenger she'd been harassing for an hour was the federal official with authority to prosecute her racism and expose her husband's criminal empire. The most viral aviation incident in history proved that in federal airspace, as in life, the most powerful person in the room isn't always the one making the most noise. Sometimes it's the one reading quietly, watching carefully, and waiting for the right moment to remind everyone that true authority comes from service, not self-importance. If you've witnessed discrimination, stayed silent when you should have spoken up, or judged someone based on appearance rather than character, let this story remind you dignity, respect, and justice aren't about where you sit on an airplane. They're about who you choose to be when no one thinks you're watching. If this story opened your eyes to the power of maintaining dignity in the face of hatred, hit that like button right now. Your support helps us share more stories that matter. And if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of how they look or where they come from, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, because sometimes the most important lesson isn't about what happened to the people in this story. It's about what we choose to do when faced with our own moments of truth. What would you have done if you were on that plane? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, the next time you're tempted to judge someone by their appearance, you might just be looking at the person who holds more power than you ever imagined. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story where we explore what happens when assumptions meet reality.